Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that helps you discover deeper levels of truth, meaning, and wholeness. I'm your host, Artem, and our guest today is a psychotherapist, author, and longtime meditation practitioner. As a therapist, he's done his rounds working in a psychiatric ward, social services, and maintaining a private practice since 1979. As a teacher, he taught at Naropa University for 25 years and lectured all throughout the world. He's also a Vajrayana Buddhism practitioner with over 40 years of practice under his belt. On his journey, he has been fortunate enough to be a student of Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche and to meet a number of other realized teachers. He's the author of Already Free, a fascinating book that explores the relationship between psychotherapy and awakening. Bruce Tift, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, happy to be here with you. And so I'd like to start with, one of the questions that I've been asking for a while, and that's how does psychotherapy or healing relate to meditation or awakening? And I've read some brief perspectives on this, and I got to explore this question a little bit with a past guest, Locke Kelly, who also has a similar background as you. With that said, I believe your book, Already Free, is a very in-depth exploration of this question. And I'd love to dive into this question, but first, it would be great to hear a little bit about your journey and some of the pivotal events that made this question come alive for you.
Well, who knows, that things come out of so many complex factors that we're always making up a story. So I don't mind doing that, but, hopefully none of us take these, histories and so forth too seriously. But let's see, I grew up in a family where especially my mother was very interested in personal growth. So I was sort of already conditioned in a certain way to that sort of view. Started a clinical psych graduate program, dropped out after a year, worked a bit, went over to Europe, got a motorcycle, went around Europe and North Africa, and then overland to India and Nepal, where I was there for about a year and then gone about 2 years total. And in India and Nepal, I ran into a number of Tibetan refugee groups and was very impressed just with their fresh energy, their lack of sexist type of, at least obvious display. He seemed very, cheerful. Was able to study with a Tibetan teacher outside of Kathmandu for a while. And when I came back, met Trungpa Rinpoche like in 71 and then reconnected with him when I moved to Boulder. Well, I was in Boulder, Colorado in 72. He came in 74, I think, became his student formally, and then was with him, part of that community with my wife until his death in 87. So I think pivotal events were traveling, getting out of this culture. So it was hard to take my identity too seriously after a while. Being exposed to Tibetan or Vajrayana Buddhism, which resonated very deeply with me. Certainly connecting with Trungpa Rinpoche, who was a very impactful person. My marriage, I have 3 daughters. That was very part of my whole process of gradually, with a lot of resistance, softening up and, being more available to my vulnerabilities. Teaching, working with the people I do have with as clients, there's so many factors, but, if we're going to sort of have a story related to this discussion, those are probably some important issues.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you sharing some of that. And what a fascinating life. And, the ability to travel on a motorcycle in your youth. I feel like that's that's the thing that so many of us would have benefited from, and so few of us got to do. So it's so beautiful that you got to do that. And the fact that your mother was already immersed in personal growth, I think that's also a rare experience for many of us. And you mentioned that, you and your wife were both part of the community and students of.
Yeah, we actually met doing the master's program at Naropa, and so that was very intensive beginning, to the relationship, and both were students of Trungpa Rinpoche. And then a couple of years after graduating, I returned and started teaching there. She taught for a while. Her specialty is like death and dying and aging. Mine has been more couples and personal growth, that sort of thing. But yeah.
Yeah, what a blend. Relationships and death and dying. That's sounds like that's the foundation of the path in one way or another. Yeah, it's fascinating. And, in your book, you make the distinction between what you call the developmental path, which could also, I guess, be understood as like psychological maturity and healing, and the fruitional path, which is that of spiritual realization or awakening. Can you explain how you see these paths as being different and where they intersect?
Well, it's not real clear, but I would say that one understanding is that the developmental view, which is basically the basic view of Western therapy, not all schools, but basically, starts with an understanding, a belief, which I think is supported by a lot of my own clinical experience, that our experience as very, very young little beings is profoundly impactful in terms of how we adapt to our experience, our life, other people, and that we all will sort of do whatever we have to do to survive, because we can't talk, we can't walk, we're immature, we're dependent, we have to cue off of others all the time. So we come up with a variety of survival strategies. If we're lucky and have a fortunate emotional environment, physical environment, social environment, we have more likelihood of those survival strategies having a certain fluidity to them that can be updated more frequently, because we can risk being more vulnerable because our experience has been more positive or safe as a child. If our experience is very toxic, dangerous, neglectful, abusive, our strategies tend to sort of get put in concrete very quickly, because we don't want to mess with our survival strategies if it's a dangerous world. And so we come into adulthood, and most people, I think, somewhat unconsciously continue to relate to themselves and others in the world out of these young templates, these young strategies. And that's especially true when we feel threatened or anxious or vulnerable or something like that. That's when there's strong regressive pressure. And so we rely on what's sort of most basic. So a lot of our adult capacities sort of get lost temporarily under difficult circumstances. So a lot of Western therapy, a developmental view, tries to clarify what are those strategies that I'm still relying on that are not wrong. They are actually our best effort to take care of ourselves. That's what they were. That's what they are now. It's not pathology, which unfortunately, a lot of times in the West, neurosis is addressed as pathology. I don't see it that way. I just see it basically as an out-of-date effort to take the best care of ourselves possible. So a lot of Western therapy could be understood as bringing those efforts of self-care into alignment with our current adult capacities and our current adult life circumstances. Because especially when things are difficult, we tend to behave as if we were still a child in our young families of origin. And that's especially vivid in relationships, I find. from a Buddhist point of view, I'd say the developmental view is working with the progression of capacities on a relative level. And my understanding, I'm not a Buddhist scholar, but my understanding is that relative experience is basically everything that has form, everything that's constructed. And then absolute experience, as I understand it, is just basically open awareness or nature mind or whatever we want to call that. It has no ascribable qualities. You can't get a hold of it with your senses or your thoughts, but it's always present. It's the most intimate of our aspects of experiencing. So from that point of view, from the Buddhist point of view, developmental work is really to facilitate our slowly probably cultivating a capacity to touch into this open, always present awareness just more frequently, maybe a little bit longer, start to have that openness gradually become integrated into the sort of texture of our daily life. But from that point of view, we don't mean integration like in the West. In the West, we tend to take, I don't know if it was Hegel or whoever, but we tend to take this thesis, antithesis, synthesis view of integration. So we come up with a new version. I don't prefer that. To me, I see a Western Buddhist or developmental fruitional view more like an intimate relationship. And if you're in a relationship, or any of the listeners are, you don't try to integrate with your partner. You don't try to come up with one sort of emotional entity. You have two separate people who have an overlap, as you were asking before. There's an overlap. Yeah, it's like a Venn diagram where you have a separate self, you have another separate self, and you have this third sort of energetic arising that is more complex than the two separately. I prefer to see, sort of more of like an intimate relationship where there's a back and forth rather than think that there's some integration between Buddhism and psychotherapy.
Yeah. I guess the question that comes up in hearing some of what you're saying is, it seems to me that, some people can be very much entrenched in psychotherapy and, be doing therapy for years, but not really engaging with meditation or spiritual practice. And I've also come in contact with people that are very deep into spiritual practice or meditation, but they've never engaged in therapy. So I'm just wondering how, how that occurs. And, because for me, it seems like there's work to be done from both perspectives. And it seems really important to integrate those. Yeah.
Well, then you might do that. But the fact that you have that view isn't going to change the style of engagement that most of those people have. So we have to let people be who they are because we're not in control of them. We're not even letting them be who they are. We're just basically returning to the reality of powerlessness in relationships over and over again. And so we can have our opinions about what's helpful, but I don't think it's going to be too much of a benefit to have some idea that other people should agree with us.
Yeah, I guess it's the question is like, well, I'm assuming that you have a similar view to that. Yeah, I don't know. I don't even know what the question is around here, but it's like, I guess there's something in me that wants people to see the benefit in both of those approaches, and how there's limitations if one is say just meditating and not, just going off and meditating, going off on a retreat and not engaging in a relationship and not looking at the patterns that, may be manifesting in a relationship, because you can probably have a deep level of realization and still have unhelpful patterns. And then there's also like the limitations in therapy, where it's like, you could kind of still be in this story or this identification, and you can keep doing therapy for the rest of your life and never step out of that. So that's how I think about it. And that's what arises for me. I don't know if you see it in a similar way or.
Sure, but if you cared to, I mean, it might be a little more personal, but if you cared to, you could be curious about that component of compulsivity that you're describing, where you want other people to join your reality. But that's exactly the opposite of allowing contradictory energies to coexist without any fantasy of resolution, which is the nature maybe between relative and absolute, or Buddhism and psychotherapy. So if you wanted, you could ask yourself, what feelings would I have to feel if I gave up my agenda that other people should see it my way?
Yeah, there's definitely something for me, like with wanting a sense of shared reality, right? Like there's a sense of, yeah. And I guess at times I'm less okay with not having that shared reality, but then there are times where there's like, oh, there's no shared reality here. It's like we're like in completely two different worlds.
Yeah, and it's possible that our human experience will be this never resolvable alternation between feeling more connected and feeling more separate, which to me is sort of the nature of an intimate relationship, that we're going to alternate between separateness, connection, or self-care and care for others, having our own different realities and then sharing realities or feelings, but that's just a never resolvable disturbance that is not going to go away. It's not going to get fixed or healed or whatever people, fantasy is. But I think that fantasy is a impulse. Again, it's an impulse toward self-care. It's not pathological, but it's an impulse to get out of the unresolvable disturbance of the fact that we're all both separate and connected. It's not one or the other.
Yeah, I want to circle back around to this notion of separateness and interdependence, because I think that's something you point to, and I think that's a really important point. The other question, though, that to follow up on therapy is, do you believe that people can find healing and become psychologically mature without engaging in psychotherapeutic work? Is it possible to develop in this way on our own?
Of course. I mean, psychotherapy is, let's say, maybe 120 years old in the West, and people have been maturing themselves, apparently, for thousands of years, if we go by, written evidence or anthropological evidence. And people have done that with shamanism, with, group practices, with getting hit by lightning bolts out of the blue, by mysterious means, by just trying to be a wakeful person in their own language. I mean, people have been becoming mature, and people have been waking up, as far as I can guess, without the use of psychotherapy or meditation. Those are tools. They're not necessary conditions.
Yeah, and I guess then I'm also curious, how would you describe psychological or spiritual maturity? How will we think about what?
I probably wouldn't, but I can give it a try.
Yeah. That's a question that I've been kind of thinking about. So I'm curious to hear what perspectives you have on that.
A number of years ago, I just tried to actually list qualities of different levels of experiencing, and I think one was sort of pre-personal, more biological. One was personal, and then one was more spiritual path capacities. And there were, I came up with maybe about 15 or 20 in each category. So it's not just one or two things, but a couple central things, I think, are that in the pre-personal biological level of experiencing, which we all have, we tend to go for immediate survival as our highest priority, especially when threatened. We tend to be identified with our experience. We tend toward black and white, all or nothing organization. We tend to cue off of others, sort of have a certain type of constant vigilance. We want immediate resolution. We want to put safety and security as our highest priority, things like that. Adult maturity, adult capacities might have to do with pulling back the location of both one's disturbance and therefore one's personal power back to oneself, away from projecting our issues onto others, both positive and negative. A tolerance of more complexity, less black and white organization, tolerance of delayed gratification, some tolerance of a complex sense of self rather than a simplistic version of who we are. Some degree of tolerance of emotional vulnerabilities, things like that. As far as a spiritual path list of capacities, I would say a progressive disidentification with one's experiencing so that we have our experience rather than be identified with it. More of a tendency to live in our immediate experiencing rather than past and future plans or dramas. A tolerance of returning to the truth of one's immediate experience over and over and over again, which has to include experience we don't like as being just as valid as experience we do like. Tolerance of resting in uncertainty or not knowing or openness. Sort of it's hard to describe exactly, but an ability to hold contradictory experience simultaneously with no resolution, including the sense that our experience is somehow real and at the same time is without any objective reality to it. So that's not an intellectual capacity, it's an experiential capacity. Probably a gradual dissolution of our fantasy of being a separate self. And with that, probably more spontaneous compassion. Doesn't mean we have to act a certain way, but more sense of we're all just an expression of life. I don't know, that's what's popping into my mind at the moment.
Yeah, no, that felt very comprehensive. And, you mentioned the pre-personal, the personal, and, in your book, you talk about that, the pre-personal, the personal, interpersonal, and non-personal. And that's like...
I just sort of basically ripping off Ken Wilber, when he was one of the first people to come up with pre-personal, personal, and transpersonal.
Yeah.
So, this is that was sort of an extension into the world of relationships,
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And, in hearing you speak, I get a lot of these threads that I see through developmental models like Keegan's model or Susan Cook-Gruder's or Ken Wilber's. And it's this capacity, for more complexity, capacity for more uncertainty, more fluidity in the identity and not being so entrenched in identity. And that's what these developmental models all seem to point to. They seem to describe what psychological or spiritual maturity looks like.
Mm-hmm. But everybody's just making up their own version of a thing. We shouldn't take anybody's theories too seriously.
Yeah, for sure. It's just a way of looking. It's a model. And I guess it's also like, it's impossible for us to not create models. Like that's kind of what we do is we create models, but perhaps we can develop the capacity to hold them lightly. And maybe that's what happens as a person gets mature. There's still an ability to create intricate models of how to explain reality. And then there's also like, well, it's unexplainable. It's a complete mystery.
Both at the same time, and you start to use models then as a tool in service of certain priorities or intentions, rather than think that the models are a description of reality.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, I really appreciated the chapter in your book about anxiety. And I think that's, relevant to everybody. And we have different ways of thinking. Yeah. And we have different ways of thinking about anxiety. But can you speak on what you see anxiety to be, what you believe causes it or perpetuates it, and how we can more skillfully navigate it?
Well, I don't think it's caused by anything. I think it's part of being human. We're vulnerable life forms, and probably every cell on our body in some way or another knows that we can be wiped out at any moment, because we will be. It's just when, not if. And that's our evolutionary, makeup over maybe billions of years. But some people have described fear as a response to an immediate threat and anxiety as a response to a potential threat. So anxiety has a little different quality than fear, I think, to use that language, which is because it's a signal about a potential danger. There's a lot of room for our projections to then sort of start filling up that space. If it's an immediate fear, if I was back in Colorado and hiking in the mountains and a bear came around the corner, I'm not going to feel anxious. I'm going to feel fear and, take off or do whatever I can do. But if I then the next week said, whoa, if I go hiking again, I might run into a bear. Maybe I'll die. That's anxiety, because it's not happening yet. But I think it's fear and anxiety are probably really at the heart of our hardwiring. I mean, people keep changing their ideas about brain chemistry and function, so I can't pretend to be up to date, but at least a familiar view is like looking at the amygdala as sort of the threat center. I think some people are disagreeing with that, but we should just count on, in my experience, or I count on anyway, being triggered. And because I have a very fortunate lifestyle, it's mostly anxiety that's getting triggered, not an immediate threat. But I count on having my anxiety triggered, many, many times every day. It's just part of life. And if it's a small thing, I just it's a bump I go over, like a speed bump or whatever, If it's associated with some unresolved historic issue or vulnerability, then it's more likely to for my attention to go really say, this is a threat. I've got to, look at it, got to figure it out. But I think, generally speaking, if it's accurate that we should just count on having anxiety and fear, but anxiety is part of our human experience, then probably best to just train ourselves to have an experience of anxiety as anxiety with absolutely no explanation, because almost all of our explanations are not actually accurate. They're not happening. But nobody likes formless anxiety, because it's like, whoa, I'm going to die. But where's the problem? Oh, I'm going to die. But, it's like, your hair goes on the back of the head of our ancestors 100,000 years ago. They're going to look for the problem, But what I find is that almost everyone that I've ever worked with anyway, we all tend to unconsciously and immediately try to ascribe a cause to that anxiety, because then that gives us the relative security of having form to that anxiety. And if there's a cause, that usually implies there should be a solution. So then I can get all involved with looking for solving that condition with an unconscious fantasy. If I solve it, then I can have my life without anxiety. But it's almost never the issue. And so basically it serves as a dissociative distraction, where I can get involved worrying about if I'm going to, pay the bill tomorrow, instead of just recognizing I'm feeling really panicked right now. And there's not really a lot I can do about it. I don't like that. I think I'd rather focus on, my relationship or my spiritual dramas or, what I'm going to eat tomorrow or, whatever. Because then we're back in the world of sort of concrete problems that I hope that I can actually do something about. But you can't do anything about your human nature except for have either a conscious or an unconscious relationship with it.
Yeah, yeah. It makes sense that we tend to construct the story to make it more manageable. Like, oh, that's how I'm going to manage it. But in doing that, we never actually face it, we never actually look at it. And this perpetual making stories about why we're anxious. Well, I guess the question is then, how does the experience change, right? Because we're always going to have anxiety, right? But I imagine that it actually is worse when we're constantly trying to manage it in this way by telling the stories.
Well, it's worse in the long run, but not in the short run.
Mm-hmm.
If you're out in the woods and you hear a big noise, it's going to be more disturbing than if you know what it is. Or in our evolutionary past, is it going to eat me or can I eat it? Or, you want some clarity to know what to do. So again, that's that pre-personal biological level of wanting resolution, of sort of not tolerating uncertainty, which it's not a bad thing. It's just a biological level of experiencing. It's not in alignment with some higher potentials. So if we don't understand the benefit we're getting from these stories, it's going to be harder to work with them because we'll have a tendency to sort of pathologize them or say, oh, that's bad, or I shouldn't be having these stories. I'm supposed to just rest in open awareness, blah, 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 like that. But if we understand, no, I'm actually invested in these stories. Not only that, for most people, unconsciously, we're invested in never solving them. Because if I solve them, I'm in danger of coming back into immediate vulnerability and recognizing that the relative truth of my human experiencing at that point, which is really difficult. Better to be involved with a familiar story. Oh, I'm being abandoned. I'm being rejected. Oh, I was a selfish person, blah, blah, blah. What are they going to do? What are they going to think of me? I mean, we've been there 10,000 times. We're not feeling threatened, really. And so most people actually, in my experience, claim they want to solve these patterns of distraction, but we actually have an investment in making sure they're never solved, because then they would lose their dissociative function.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's like, why would anybody even want to let go of these kind of stories? Because they're like somehow a protective layer, right? And it's like, why would how would you even convince somebody, or how would you even make them see that that's not helpful if they're so attached to that being like, oh, actually, I feel better when I tell myself this story. It's like a way to regulate.
Well, your language is back to how to convince them or make them.
Yeah.
But maybe that's not our possibility to convince or make people. Maybe it's more like we offer something and they'll do what they do with it. But probably best to be responsible for the endless number of ways we're doing that with ourselves. So if we understand, oh, actually, it seems like I have profoundly contradictory feelings about doing my personal work, whether it's relative therapy, let's say, or fruitionally organized or oriented spiritual path work. If we understand, whoa, I have really contradictory feelings about moving along here, there's some panic that's starting to come up as my sense of self gets a little shaky, and I'm having to acknowledge how exposed I feel every moment. Well, then we might be a little more kind to ourselves and say, yeah, sometimes I'll do that, and sometimes I won't do that. And maybe it's the kindness that carries the greater potential for transformation, rather than which side of that yes or no, closed open category I happen to be in. And if we get more kind to our own resistance or reluctance, then we might be more kind to other people and have less of an agenda to wake them up,
Yeah, that's helpful. And would you say that the pathway to kind of being with that is to getting out of story is getting into sensation, getting into the body? Like,
that's what I prefer. Yeah, but not everything works for everybody. So, but I've found that training my attention to come back to immediate sensation level, embodied presence, whatever we call it, vulnerability, is a very immediate way to step out of our identification with all these out-of-date patterns of experience. It doesn't make them go away. What we're doing is challenging our identification with them. We're not healing them or making them disappear or something like that, in my experience. So, I mean, they can in long-term work, but not really in the moment. So I see bringing our attention to sensation level experience as an immediate practice of disidentification with story or drama or self, as a way to introduce ourselves to the experience of impermanence, because there's no such thing as a permanent sensation. I've never found it. We start to strengthen our practice of deconstruction, which is a lot of Buddhist practice, because you're not going to find a sensation of abandonment or guilt or humiliation or shame. So a lot of times when people present that, they may not like it, but I suggest that actually they're pretending on some level to feel shame or humiliation in the moment. Doesn't mean there's not a lot of historic momentum, but at that moment, they're choosing unconsciously to pretend to feel shame rather than to stay embodied with some very intense vulnerabilities. And a lot of people are very invested, of course, in their identity dramas, and I don't try to, take it away from them.
yes. So would you say that from this perspective, emotions or even anxiety is a kind of construction, really on a more immediate level? Whatever we think is anxiety, it's some kind of a sensation. Maybe it's some kind of contracting in our chest.
Yeah. The contraction in our chest, our gut feels all knotted up, our throat's constricted, we feel numb, we feel agitated, we feel hot or cold, we want to crawl out of our skin, we want to punch somebody. There's these body-based experiences. And I think if you look at evolution, body came before emotions and emotions came before thoughts. So I just speculate that staying at a body level is probably more fundamental than our emotional experience and certainly our interpretations. But if I'm feeling sort of hurt by something my wife says, I can feel that. And even if I call it, hurt, I can see that there's already a subtle degree of dissociation where I'm starting to be identified with the label of hurt. But if I stay at the sensation level, I don't find any damage. I mean, I want to because I want to blame her, but I don't find any actual damage or harm that's happening to me. I just don't want to be there. I want to get out,
Yeah, it's so interesting. What I think I'm realizing is, through my own practice and trying to, working with embodiment and somatic practices, actually being with the sensations, it's like often they're very subtle. They're very subtle, and they're not that serious, but there's something when you're not fully disidentified from the story, and the story comes in, and it's like you said, this is hurt, right? Like that can be very subtle. It's like, I feel hurt. You don't even think of that as like an emotion or anything, but it's already an interpretation, and that interpretation mixed with that subtle sensation, that subtle contraction or the knot in your stomach, it becomes very overwhelming. It becomes so much bigger.
Right. Well, it's not actually subtle. It's our lifetime of ignoring it that makes it appear subtle. If you were to focus on any part of your body, your knee, your stomach or something, at first it might feel like a little vague, but if you just stayed with that attention, you're going to get more and more details, more and more clarity, more vivid intensity as you stay with it, probably. And so with practice, it's not what we initially might call subtle, but at first, of course, so we accept that. And again, if we understand that a lot of our primitive, biologically based impulse is to pull in what's positive and get rid of what's negative when something is disturbing or negative, we're going to have a very powerful, hardwired impulse to get away from it. And if we don't get away from it by running or getting into a fight or just collapsing, like some of Peter Levine's work about the nature of trauma, like that blocked, natural response. We don't do that. We block it, we contain it to be socially acceptable. And we tend to then sort of get very invested in staying with what's familiar. And if somebody really stays at the sensation level, they may find that their claims about their emotional issues sort of start to fall apart. They don't go away, but it's like we realize, actually, I have to keep throwing fuel on that fire to keep claiming that my partner was unkind to me, or that, gosh, I was really hurtful to that person yesterday, or whatever my drama is. It has to be maintained, with a lot of effort and creativity and discipline. That's how we maintain our neurotic avoidance strategies, because they're not true. They're not based in reality, so they have to be maintained with a lot of effort, actually.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Fascinating what we can create.
Yes, it is. We're very creative. Yeah.
Yeah. So in this chapter about anxiety, you also talk about struggle, and you write, struggle is an incredibly complex and effective way to pretend to ourselves that we're dealing with our lives without really doing so. Please unpack that. That's fascinating.
Well, sort of related to some of what we're talking about, I think, which is, let's say that I grow up like I did, let's say, learning that it was smart to be independent and it wasn't smart to be dependent. That was my, conditioned history. So I come into adulthood, and it's very likely that I will sort of claim on some level to be in a struggle because I want to give and receive love. I want people to recognize me. I want to feel understood and maybe held or whatever. I just want that sense of feeling like I can be dependent and it'll be safe and stuff like that. But my whole history says, whoa, that's not smart. It's not going to happen, or you'll get, love withheld, or, something bad, so don't do that. And I can convert that very easily, of course, into the fantasy of struggle, or then I claim I'm somebody who's trying to feel loved. I don't get it. I try to be a good person. I'm responsible. I go out of my way to take care of other people. I don't complain, blah, blah, blah. Basically, I do my independent, self-sufficient thing. And now, but I don't feel anybody's there for me. What about me? So I can pretend that I'm in the struggle, but the actual dynamic might be that I think one way of talking about all of this inner struggle is that we have a hope that what we didn't get growing up, to use the Western view, what we didn't get growing up, we can finally get, but we have a fear that if I were to be so stupid as to really rest in that bad things are going to happen, because that was the evidence. So I have to pretend that I'm trying to be this person who is going to be loved, but I have to make sure it never happens. So in Western language, that would be a reenactment pattern, where a lot of times people talk about reenactment as, oh, I'm trying to get the recognition or the love. I'm trying to get the safety. I'm trying to feel that my feelings will be acknowledged, that I can have my voice, I can have my boundaries, blah, blah, blah. But the actual reenactment is I'm trying in ways that guarantee I'll never get it. Because that's the reenactment that as a child, I didn't get it. And that's what I organize my sense of self and my defenses around. And so then I can pretend to be in a state of struggle so that I take care of both sides of this hope and fear. I'm not giving up my hope, but I'm not abandoning my safety of making sure it never happens. So then that's a very stable psychic structure, actually, process that can incorporate almost anything, because it's just sort of so general, so basic. And from a Buddhist point of view, this stabilized struggle could be understood as one way of viewing the fundamental, not the most basic, but the fundamental protection of self-absorption. That when I'm in a state of struggle, the rest of the world is sort of off something else, because I'm me, like that. And so anytime there's a struggle, if we want, one way of investigating that is to ask, well, what is it I don't want to feel? Because that's usually going to create more problems than what I hope to feel. That's usually more positive. And so in this case, it might mean for me, oh, I'm going to practice feeling that I let myself be dependent, and then I'm abandoned, then nobody's there, then I'm exploited, whatever the drama is. And I'm just going to keep coming back to that, like sensation level experience, over and over and over again. So I gradually start holding both the hope and the fear as equally valid. And I'm ready to feel either, which it's sort of hard to have a struggle if I'm ready to feel both. Struggle requires this polarization where I have a fantasy that there's this big outcome at risk, at stake. This is really serious stuff. Does that make any sense, or do you?
Yeah. I guess I'm wondering. It seems like the hope and fear is like that paradigm is a way that we maintain our identity. So and they're always flipping.
It's one of many ways. We're very creative, so it's not. We don't rely on just one strategy.
Yeah. So is there? What is the? Well, is there a resolution? Is there no resolution? There's always this sense of going from hope and fear. Because for me, it seems like with certain things in my life, I'll fall into hope and fear, and then there's.
But you don't fall into it. You choose to do it unconsciously, I would say.
Yeah. Well,
I'm not responsible if I fall into it, so there's nothing I can do about it.
Interesting. Yeah, well, I guess if I'm not seeing it right unconsciously, that means the ego is not seeing it.
Well, we have to see something to avoid it, though. We can't avoid something that we're not aware of.
So is there ways that things are, well, if you're unconsciously avoiding something, you're still avoiding it?
Well, you have to be aware of it to avoid it. Yes. So that's why I like to use the language of pretending. We're pretending to avoid something. We're pretending not to be aware of it. I prefer that, but a lot of people don't like it because consciously they don't have that feeling. And so they can claim, well, I'm not responsible for it because I'm not aware of it,
Yeah. So to not be choosing hope or fear, there has to be like a complete openness for whatever is going to arise.
Along a continuum. It's not all or nothing. Yeah.
Yeah. For myself, I see that there's, times where I'm choosing, right, or falling, or, choosing hope or fear. But then there's times where that kind of paradigm seems to dissolve and there's more of just a openness. And I guess in that space, there's more of a sense of gratitude, like that. I think in our culture, there's, hope is like a big thing. Like to have hope, it's like we should always never lose hope. Like there's a thing of never losing hope, and I guess in the difficult situations in my own life that kind of seem maybe unresolvable, and
It's very helpful. It's very helpful at that level of experiencing. If somebody's very identified with experience, better to have hope than despair. But if somebody starts to see through the apparent solidity of one's experiencing, at some point it sort of, like a lot of other things, it sort of starts to become a little counterproductive to keep investing in one side of a dualistic experience.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's just interesting to watch myself choose that, or to be in that paradigm of hope and fear, and then kind of stepping outside of it. And the more I step outside of it, then you kind of see the futility of that paradigm of hope and fear.
Yes, and you could consider having gratitude toward that struggle, not just gratitude only when you give up the struggle, because that struggle, I would say, is once again one expression of our best effort to take the best care of ourselves possible, which I think we're doing every second of our lives.
Yeah. So that in a sense, there's like in what you're saying, it feels like there's like an acceptance. There's never a pathology. There's never something wrong. It's everybody's kind of trying their best, even if, what they're doing is creating suffering for them or others.
Yes, I certainly couldn't prove that. So I think, as we said earlier, I think various theories are best understood as being in alignment with or supporting certain intentions. So if somebody has the intention of basically dissolving their fantasy of being alienated from life, I think it's helpful to take on a variety of practices, views, philosophies that basically say yes to everything. It doesn't mean behave that way. It doesn't mean don't protect yourself from a perpetrator. It just means, as an attitude, as an inner practice, say yes, which is connecting, dissolving of the fantasy of alienation, rather than this is healthy and this is pathological, which perpetuates dualistic states of mind, really.
Very interesting. Yeah. And, your book is actually also an amazing exploration of relationships. And, one way to think about like our whole experiences of relationship, and it makes sense, since you are a marriage and family therapist, that you write about this, and you've had a lot of experience working with couples and
even being married myself.
yeah. You speak about that too, which I appreciate, your own experience. One of the things you write is that couples often come into therapy with this notion of pointing the finger at their spouse, but with some work, it becomes clear that their issues with their spouses are really issues they have within themselves. And this makes me wonder if any issues we have in a relationship are really just a reflection of the issues we have within ourselves. Does it ever make sense to do couples therapy? Is couples therapy simply a way to make each individual in the couple recognize how they have been failing to take responsibility for their own inner struggles? When do we seek out couples therapy, and when do we focus on individual therapy?
Well, again, nobody knows how to have intimacy. We're all winging it. We're all making it up. But my sort of bias is to think of one way of approaching couples work. It's not the only, is to start with personal responsibility as the necessary first response to the reality that I don't think anybody can come through out of their childhood established in personal responsibility. You're a child, you have to cue off of parents, you have to cue off your siblings, after teachers, the world. So all the first, 12 or 18 or whatever years of our development are organized around cueing off of other. It's not all of it, but it's the bulk of it, especially when things are difficult, because our young, powerless survival is there. So I think we come into adulthood very embedded, established in a style of looking to the other as if they are the location of both the problem and the solution, because that is the child's world. And if you have a fortunate childhood, you have more flexibility. And like we were talking about before, if it's difficult, you have more rigidity and expectations of harm. But basically, I don't think anybody comes into adulthood having yet really put integrity as a higher priority than safety and security. You can have counter-reactive formations like maybe I had when I was young and say, I'm going to put my integrity first, but that was in reaction. It wasn't really choiceful integrity. So I see the first stage of relational work almost always to sort of start to tease apart or unglue the emotional fusion, the codependency, the enmeshment, whatever language we want, that everybody comes out of childhood with. You can't be parented without what we would call emotional fusion. You're 6 months old, you have to be emotionally fused with your parent, or you're going to really be in trouble. It's not that pathological. It's just, it belongs in the first few years of life, though. It doesn't belong when you're in your 20s. But those patterns get established. They're survival patterns, so we're not going to just give them up. Then they have to get challenged as adults. My bias is to start with challenging the inaccurate emotional fusion. Some other therapists focus more on starting with connection. I start more with the masculine energy, whatever we call it, of separateness as what makes sense to me to start with. But separateness is just half the story of intimacy. We want to work on our personal responsibility so that we can keep our heart open. We're not being personally responsible so we can say, well, fuck you, we'll each live our own lives and, No, it's like, I'm in this relationship because I want connection. I want to give and receive love. But if I can stop having this unconscious compulsion to claim you're the cause of my difficulty, so you should be the solution to it, and say, no, it sort of sucks to eat it, but if I really look at my life, I've had this issue all my life before I ever met my partner, blah, blah, So on a practical level, I often suggest people experiment with the view that any emotional reactivity is 100% one's own responsibility to work with, because almost certainly it's a lifelong core vulnerability. And so that we do not involve our partner and do not allow our partner to involve us, so to speak, with emotionally reactive energy. And instead, deal with our conflicts as practical issues using behavioral, negotiating, problem-solving thing where we just ask, hey, I have a request. Would you please put the toilet seat down? But from a ground of powerlessness. We can't control them. So it's my feeling to work with. But because we're in a relationship, our personal separate experience is not the whole story as we started off with. There's that overlap or you wouldn't have a relationship. So we have to also cultivate a wide variety of emotional and behavioral communication skills in terms of being clear, being supportive, kind, knowing when to have boundaries, when to relax our boundaries, on and on and on. It's endless, work to be more skillful in relationship. But I find that it's paradoxically safer or more practical to be emotionally close to one's partner if we are grounded in personal responsibility. So we know, hey, I'm going to take care of myself so I can get as close as I choose to this partner. And if there's a problem, I'll just step back. But if my partner is the location of my well-being, like in codependent or, relationships, then every step I take toward my partner, I'm unconsciously going to feel more stuck, more an extension of their needs. I can't say no because that's will lead to loss of relationship and abandonment or attack, or things like that. So most couples, I think, actually are regulating themselves in the relationship to make sure that there's a guarantee of a certain amount of sort of ritualized distance in the relationship. And couples do that with usually some predictable things like chronic conflict or miscommunication, loss of sexuality, overfunctioning, underfunctioning, absorption at work, absorption with parenting, blah, blah, blah. But then that means that they're using these problems as a substitute for emotional separateness. They're getting the separateness from, sticking each other with the sharp stick, from backing each other off. And so most couples come into therapy with this fantasy that the problem is that they're not connected enough. We want more connection, we want more sexual passion, but they don't consider the possibility that it's exactly what they're avoiding by mutual consent unconsciously. And so if a couple can, however they do it, investigate, establish, cultivate a sense that I'm both connected and separate, and especially when there's conflict, I'm going to take the position of separateness. I'm responsible for my difficult feelings here, not my partner. When things are friendly, then we take more of the view of connection. Hey, it's fine. I'll not worry about my boundaries. I'll cut my partner slack. There's always this back and forth. It's like breathing in and out. It's not just one thing. And so if we can cultivate that capacity, I think, strangely enough, our unconscious investment in perpetuating problems starts to fall apart and dissolve. It's very parallel to what we were talking about earlier as far as struggle or self-absorption. If I can learn how to stay present and embodied and unconditionally kind moment after moment after moment after moment till I die, I don't need protection from life. I need practical protection, but I don't need chronic, unconscious experiential protection. Same with relationships. And so, again, my bias is to start with personal responsibility, as you were asking about, and that could be individual, but I think doing it in the presence of a partner often can clarify for each person what the other person is dealing with, and the fact that, oh no, actually I got it. This is their issue that's been with them all their life, and hopefully maybe even have a little bit of compassion about that. And in couples work, you can intervene if you're working as a therapist in this never-ending impulse to blame the other person for one's pain. If you're in individual therapy, you don't get that same provocation on the spot. So it's you can then translate that back to the relationship, but it's different. So often I'll suggest that people start with that personal responsibility, and individual therapy, if that supports that, great, whatever works. But we don't want to stop there. But we want to also learn how to bring our personal presence into the provocation of an intimate relationship, which is very provocative. It's not easy. I think intimacy is probably about the most difficult thing most of us will do in the emotional realm. It's unresolvable. It's disturbing. It's going to guarantee to force out into the open any unresolved issues that we're carrying, basically, about relationship. And so I think working with one's partner in the same process actually can accelerate that work. And as maybe you saw in the book, I think not only is it helpful on the relationship level, but I think intimacy actually in our culture is one of the most powerful potential spiritual practices we can have, because it forces out into the open exactly what we're not wanting to feel, but is already there. And your intimate partner can get under your skin much better than a therapist can even, you know?
Yeah, this is fascinating, and I hope people that are listening to this can see how important this is. And what kind of blows my mind is the fact that this is not taught in school. You know, the fact that codependent these dynamics. You know, it's a part of being a child. It's a part of being a child, and we can't help but have it. And then a part of becoming an adult is kind of seeing through that and kind of learning how to take this responsibility. But nobody really teaches us that. And I guess that's where the role of therapy can come in, where as adults, we've never learned this. We might have been in a relationship for a long time, might be married, even have children. And now we're realizing like, oh, look at the dynamics here that are happening. And it's like, nobody taught us this. So we had to get to this point of where we've done so much already in our lives and we're adults with children, with our own children, and we're still playing out these kind of childish dynamics.
You know, they're out of date. Yeah, right. And, nobody's ever accused society of being mature. So, we shouldn't hold our breath waiting for society to educate us or others into maturity.
Yeah, and I guess a part of me wants to create a more mature society, or a society that and one of the, in listening to you talk, what was coming up for me is I've been engaging with this practice called circling, and I don't know if you've ever heard about it. I've been doing it for.
It's going on a lot in Boulder. If it's the same circling thing, yeah.
Yeah, probably. And the big thing, it's a relating practice. It's a way of relating. So for those that don't experience therapy, or you could maybe get a lot of the benefits that you would get from therapy through circling and relatefulness, and it is a way to be more intimate with yourself and to be intimate with others. Yeah, and it's I've done it for the last couple of years, and it's fascinating, and a lot of the stuff that you were talking about, it's like you recognize this through, like I for me, I feel like I couldn't really learn about emotions. Like I've read a lot of books about emotions, and I never really learned how to work with them or be with them until I started being in relationship with others.
Of course, it's like Alan Watts said, you can't, you're not going to take care of your thirst by eating a paper that says water on it,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And in circling, the other pieces, like, at least the way I've learned the practice is there's an emphasis on owning your experience, so being mindful of when you're projecting, mindful when you're making assumptions and interpretations. So like these kind of elements just really help see this.
What I think I recall, because it's been a number of years since I was working with some people who were doing that, but I think I recall that there's also an intention to bring a type of unconditional kindness toward whatever somebody brings up, even if it's disturbing, to group members.
Yeah, I find that when people have really done the practice for a while, that seems to be the byproduct, that kind of compassion and kindness. But early on, that's not always the case.
Of course.
Sometimes, I guess the difference between therapy is kind of seen as a safe space, but sometimes people call circling a brave space. So it's like you never know what may get triggered or the reaction somebody may have, and you have to be willing to be with whatever arises.
Yeah, and as I recall, there isn't a leader usually, isn't it? A peer group, or
the way it's usually done is there's a facilitator, but once again, when it's done very skillfully, it becomes this we space, and it becomes this kind of collective. It becomes unclear who's guiding it. It's like everybody's guiding it, everybody's leading it. So yeah, there's this kind of dispersed leadership where everybody's just showing up as an individual and also recognizing that they're a part of a collective. Yeah. So another thing that I'd like to explore is, awakening and liberation. And One of the ways that I hear awakening spoken about is seeing through the illusion of separation. And in simplistic pop spirituality, this is often interpreted as we're all one. So there's this emphasis on unity rather than individuality. And from my understanding, and I think you also point to this, is that non-duality doesn't imply oneness, but instead not two-ness. And, this implies that we're both separate and interdependent. And, perhaps understanding this deeply requires direct experience, but maybe you could speak a little bit more to this paradox and how we could better play with it.
Well, you probably know Suzuki Roshi's book, Not Two, Not One. So that sort of Zen language to talk about that. We don't just say not two, we also say not one. Basically, it's pointing for the impossibility of putting what people might call the non-dual experience into language. But it doesn't mean we don't use language for pointing or suggestion or metaphor or trying to be evocative. I mean, somebody might do it with poetry or something, but basically, I think that reading books and listening and stuff can sort of soften up the ground of receptivity. But as you said, I think it's at the level of language and concept. Language and concept is dualistic, there's no way around it. So if somebody's identified with their thinking, even if it's about non-dual experience, it's not really likely to dismantle that investment. So, but it's good, it's like the finger in the moon sort of thing. If you don't have something pointing in a certain direction, you're less likely to pay attention or investigate. So you do that and you see what arises. Some people are lucky, and who knows why, they have very clear open mind experiences that are transformative. Other people have experiences that could be transformative and for complex reasons don't build on that, and it just becomes a memory. Most people probably don't have that type of experience. It's not because of their lack of spiritual evolution or maturity, as far as I can tell. I think it's like just mysterious why it arises for some people or not. But one of the quotes in the book that I like was Baker Roshi, who said that waking up, enlightenment is an accident, but meditation makes us accident prone. So, we just try to generate a variety of factors that together just make it more likely that we'll have more moments of just open experiencing. And in that open experiencing, different traditions have different views, but my tradition, Vajrayana view, has a view, as far as I know, that when we are present, open, out of concept, that there's still experiencing going on. It's not like everything goes into a oneness of mush, or something like that, but that that experience is incredibly vivid. But upon investigation, we never find any essential nature to it. We don't find objective reality. We don't find continuity of self or anything like that. So the jargon is sort of appearance emptiness. And that's a way that makes sense to me to think about it, talk about, to use words, where we're going to have a sense of self. We're going to have a sense of other, whatever that is. Upon investigation, we're not really going to find a coherent self or a coherent anything. There's nothing that exists on a relative level that is independent of incredibly complex factors, as far as I can tell. So we want to respect the appearance, but continue the investigation, which is not just at the more obvious level. That's why using our minds from certain traditions is important, not only meditating, but that is another path. And another type of language that's used is just increased transparency of experience, so that our experience continues to rise always, but we sort of see through it, not visually, but we see through it experientially, or as far as not taking this experience as if it's of cosmic significance, as if it's personal, as if it's permanent and enduring, as if it has inherent meaning. And that's not, we were using that with the words, but at first we might try to remind ourselves of that view, which is fine, but it's actually an experience that those words are trying to point toward, that we might actually start going through our life feeling like, well, I'm here, but I'm sort of not here. I find my life very meaningful, but I can't say that it is meaningful. I can't say it's meaningless. It's sort of just what it is, but I can't really find any ground to stand on. But my experience is very vivid. If I had to say something, I'd say it's inherently meaningful, but I can't say it's meaningful really. But I can't say it's without meaning. So at some point, we relax our project of accomplishment, even spiritual accomplishment, and allow things to unfold. And who knows, maybe we'll have more frequent moments like that. Maybe we won't. If we're heading downhill, maybe it's time to get back on a practice train. If things are unfolding in a way that feels meaningful, satisfying, interesting, whatever, maybe we cooperate with that unfolding and relax our fantasy of spiritual achievement,
Yeah, I appreciate this view that you're unpacking, the Vajrayana view. And I've been working in a Mahamudra lineage. I don't know if you're familiar with Dan Brown. I imagine you are.
I've heard the name. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Mahamudra, he teaches in Mahamudra is also Vajrayana practice. And
that was Trungpa Rinpoche was Kagyu. That's the Kagyu tradition. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think Reggie Ray was also Chögyam's. Yeah. So I seem to resonate a lot with the Vajrayana style Buddhism. It seems to make the most sense for me, being a householder, a family man, being in relationships. So it really resonates. And just listening to you, speaking about the view, there is like a sense of openness right now for me in my experience. And yeah, I appreciate it. And yeah, the other thing that's, it's interesting in my exploration of Buddhism. And, one of the things that the Buddha taught, where he would say, is like, I basically teach the end of suffering. So that's something that I've been thinking about, like, well, what does that even mean? Or what does that look like? Is there even such a thing? And, I think it's become clear that wanting to be free of unpleasant emotions is perhaps impossible, and nor would that be helpful. And I'm happy that there's actually an increasing number of people who have been speaking out against such emotional perfection models of awakening. And, for example, the spiritual teacher Adeshanti recently announced his retirement due to his ongoing struggles with PTSD. And, in your book, you also mentioned that you still have frustration in your marriage, despite being married for so long and being such a deep practitioner. So I really appreciate these kind of vulnerable shares, as they make it easier for the rest of us to embrace our humanness and imperfection. And, with all that said, I am curious, what do you think is, a better way for people to think about awakening and liberation? Because I do think there is this kind of view of like the end of suffering is like, things will be perfect or something.
Well, as I've said, when somebody has that fantasy, I would say that it's possible to have a life without pain or without disturbance, without vulnerability, I would say they're doing the best to take care of themselves in that moment with this, to me, fantasy. And if they came to me asking for opinions, I'd share that my thought that this is probably an out-of-date fantasy that probably has some pretty obvious limitations, but I'm not going to go out trying to convince people of that. But let's say somebody's asking like you are. I think that what's most reliable is what Trungpa Rinpoche told me right at the very beginning of my connection with him. I was describing this practice where I could generate this sort of experiential tunnel and go into it and come out with no thought at all, just rest in no thought. I was very proud of it and everything. So I was talking with him and he said, he had the high squeaky voice. He said, just be open. Just be open. And looking back, I think there was actually a transmission quality because it really impacted me. And that's been a reference that really makes sense to me ever since, which is to return to openness rather than come up with some, guidelines about how to get enlightened. So if somebody is willing to come back into immediate embodied openness, practice unconditional kindness, stay out of interpretations, do our best to keep our heart open while we're still taking care of ourselves. I think that it invites and perhaps potentiates a certain process that's already there. And it doesn't mean don't study and don't think about all those things, but I think the most powerful thing is a practice of openness. But that openness has to be immediate, embodied, experiential, not just intellectual, calm and clear and like that. I'm just as open to feeling closed as I am open to feeling open. Or it's not unconditional openness. So it's openness to the full big mess of being a human, which is going to be arising every second, and then we're going to die. So, another quote of his that I like was in the book is that the bad news is we're falling through the air without a parachute. The good news is there's no ground.
No ground. Yeah,
I think that's a riot. I love that one.
Yeah, I love it.
It's the same idea that we return to openness. We return to being so present that we continually undermine our impulse to try to hang on to something solid and some formula, even if it's a spiritual formula. So that would be my take.
Yeah. Yeah, Bruce. This has been a fascinating conversation. Really got to cover a lot. Look at the developmental view, fruitional view, kind of therapy and awakening, how they intersect, and anxiety, struggle, very interesting things about that. And we spoke about relationships and couples therapy, intimacy. So we really covered a lot. And, I just like to say, is there anything else you wish I would have asked, or is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Really appreciate you, Bruce.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you're doing this work, and I hope it's helpful for you as well as for the people who listen to it. I think the more people there are who are genuinely interested in being wakeful and developing kindness for themselves and others, there's practical things like, trying to not have so many people killed in Gaza and stuff like that. It's very real. But I think if somebody is interested in a longer term sort of view of having how to be a benefit to all of us, I think it's really important that more and more people, investigate the basic sort of ground out of which both kindness and harm arise. It's the same ground, So the more that we can be aware, the more choice we have, and hopefully slowly there will be more people. But I'm not going to hold my breath about that. That's just a hope, as we said before.
Yeah. I hear
anyway,
you.
I'm glad you're doing your work.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. I guess one last question is there anything else that you're working on? Is there anything you're focusing on? Already Free is a great book, and it's something I really recommend for not just for people on a spiritual path or that are into meditation, but I think it's a really good book that explains therapy and codependency. And it's, it was just interesting for me reading a lot of the stuff about the relationships, being married and having young children and dealing with some of those difficulties. And so there's a lot of helpful things there. But I'm wondering if there's anything else. Maybe there's another book, or what else is going on for you?
I don't think of myself as an author, and definitely not as some missionary or something. So I'm an old guy now, so it's unlikely that I'll get it together to do that. I'm always curious about things. Like a current just thought to share it, not developed really at this point, is that I've recently sort of been curious about brain experience, relationship, and you are familiar probably with what's called the hard question in philosophy.
Consciousness, yeah.
How does the material function of the brain get experienced as subjective experience? Nobody can come up with an explanation for that. But it has occurred to me that if there's no causality that can be demonstrated between material reality and subjective experience, then it seems likely that it's equally true to go in the other direction. So that just because we have a subjective experience may not mean that that is about material reality. So a lot of spiritual people talk about, well, the nature of reality is love, or things like that. I think that that's their experience, but I think a lot of spiritual practitioners make the same mistake as the materialistic scientists. It's just in the opposite direction. That think because somebody has had an experience that the nature of reality is love, the universe is love, that means that actually that's true on a literal level. Maybe it's just their experience. Maybe it's equally unclear what the relationship between that experience is and reality. Maybe we shouldn't just be naive as spiritual practitioners, Anyway, that was just a thought that.
Yeah, I guess real quick, because what's coming up, mentioning the hard problem of consciousness. What is your view on idealism or mind only? Then it's like the idea that everything is just mind, and that even this experience of being physical, it's just all awareness or mind.
Nobody can prove any of these views are right.
Of course.
But I prefer a non-dual view for whatever reason, which is that if there is the appearance of form, I would prefer to leave it at that instead of be spiritually reductive and say, well, actually, it's not really an appearance of form, it's just mind. I mean, why? Why not just leave it as an unresolvable disturbance? I think, when people say it's mind only, that's perhaps an unconscious effort to get out of complexity, out of groundlessness. But I don't know. Got me.
Yeah, let's leave people with that paradox. It's unresolvable. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks so much, Bruce. Appreciate you.
Well, thanks for inviting me. Fun to have these discussions.
Yeah. Be well.
Take care. Take care. Bye-bye.